President, please be seated. The court is now back in session, and the floor is given back to Counsel Copper to resume the questioning to the expert. You may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon again, Mr. Morris. A brief follow-up question in relation to that excerpt from your dissertation regarding Heng Samrin. Did you bring your dissertation with you, or would you like me, through the intervention of the President, to give you a copy of that specific page? Because I will return to this subject.
No, I didn't bring my dissertation with me, and I would like a copy of that specific page. Thank you.
With your leave, Mr. President.
Juste une observation, Monsieur.
Just a remark, Mr. President. In light of what the expert has said, I have the impression that the part quoted by my colleague is a two-page document, and then there is a conclusion at the end by the expert, which is apparently interesting to read as well. I want to make sure that the expert has received the 2 pages on which the quotation is found, 197 in the ERN and 198. I make this remark because there is a concluding paragraph at the end of the quotation by my colleague, and it appears important to read that as well. That will enable the expert to react on both paragraphs. I myself have a copy of that document.
Yeah, I cannot possibly object to that. It's his own dissertation, but maybe he could get a full copy of what the chamber has, then the expert could have a look at everything. I have no problem with that at all.
For the time being, my understanding is the 2 pages requested already are here, so perhaps if those could be given to the expert. I don't know if he can digest it in this short period of time, but I leave that to you, obviously.
Avec votre autorisation, Monsieur.
With your leave, Mr. President, and with the assistance of the court officer, if there's no objection to that, I'm ready to give the expert a copy of the document. That is my copy with the 2 relevant pages.
President, yes, please.
I will move on, Mr. President, and may I suggest, Mr. Expert, if you do wish to receive a copy of everything that we have, I'm sure you'll be able to indicate that to the chamber. Before I move to my second subject, some brief additional questions in relation to your sources. Is it correct that you do not read or write Khmer?
That is correct.
Is it also correct that in your footnotes or references to your sources in your book, your 1999 book, there is nothing quoted from what I would like to call Democratic Kampuchea contemporaneous documents, such as minutes of the Standing Committee of the CPK, telegrams from military divisions all the way up to the military, the general military staff. Such documents, revolutionary flags. I believe there's one reference to one revolutionary flag, but I think that's the only one. So is it correct that in your 1999 book there is no reference to DK contemporaneous documents?
That may be correct. I haven't gone over that. That's right.
Another question I have, did you use in your book primary contemporaneous American or Chinese sources?
Probably, I would have used newspaper articles, for example, contemporaneous, which would be contemporaneous American sources. Not Chinese, no.
I understand. In relation to American primary sources, as you know, at one point in time, many diplomatic cables of U.S. embassies, conversations between, for instance, Henry Kissinger and General Suharto have been publicized, have been gone from confidential to open sources. Have you used those American primary sources for your book?
No, I don't recall having used them.
And then my last question, for the subject methodology and sources. Have you done research in relation to Democratic Kampuchea or Vietnam after the publication of your book? And if yes, are you, when you're giving answers, sometimes using these documents or sources or books, or can we safely assume that most, maybe everything that you're saying finds its foundation in your book and dissertation and your publications?
Yes, I would say that everything I say, or almost everything I say, finds its foundation in my book and publications, and other publications of mine.
And then final follow-up question, have you followed the proceedings of this tribunal?
I followed the proceedings a little bit at the beginning of the tribunal, and but not very closely, no.
Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Cocker, sorry for interrupting, but I don't want this to be lost. It's technical. You suggested to provide to the expert relevant parts of documents you want to use. Now, it's 216 pages if we have to copy the whole excerpt we have in the case file. The reason I mention it now, because then your staff can work on it. Perhaps they can identify those pages you would wish the expert to study overnight. We can then make copies of them.
As a matter of fact, the excerpts that I will be using from his dissertation, I will be using right now. So I think before 4 o'clock it's clear, and if any questions follow up, then we could discuss it here in the courtroom. As I said earlier, Mr. Expert, Mr. Morris, My second subject is also a very interesting subject. I'm using your phraseology, something what you call the quote-unquote imperial ambitions of Vietnam, or imperial impulses of Vietnam. Could you describe to the Chamber what you mean with Vietnamese imperial ambitions?
Well, the history of Vietnam is the history of a long march south from what is now northern Vietnam to conquer territories which were once occupied by other ethnic groups, including the Cham and the Cambodians. Large parts of what is now southern Vietnam used to be part of Cambodia, and the French assisted in the official dismemberment of that part of southern Vietnam from Cambodia during their colonial rule. And I also think that the whole concept of the Indo-Chinese Federation, which was initiated in the Communist International in the 1930s, was a guiding impulse and motivating factor in the behavior of the Vietnamese communists towards Cambodia in subsequent decades. I think that the idea of the Indo-Chinese Federation was modeled on the Soviet Union itself. That is, that there would be one major political ethnic entity which provided the, quote, leadership, unquote, for the other ethnic groups which were federated with it. So, as in the case of the Soviet Union, the Russian ethnic group was dominant over the other non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union. So the Vietnamese conceived Indochina as a place where the Vietnamese would be dominant over the Lao and Cambodian in terms of leadership. And they were considered themselves more advanced than the people of Laos and Cambodia.
Let me follow up on this now that you've mentioned the Indo-Chinese Federation already. In your book, there's no Khmer or French translation, so I'll be only using the English. On your in your book, English ERN 01001732, you say the following. Traditional Vietnamese imperial ambitions in Indochina had been given a veneer of Marxist-Leninist legitimacy through the concept of an Indo-Chinese Federation formulated by the Comintern in 1930 at the time of the founding of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. So that's a follow-up question. What did you mean when you wrote a veneer of Marxist-Leninist legitimacy?
What I meant was that I think the Vietnamese originally had, and Ho Chi Minh, as he later came to be called, he was then known as Nguyen Ai Quoc, founded the Vietnamese Communist Party in January of 1930. But his decision to call it the Vietnamese Communist Party was overruled by the Communist International, the Comintern, and in October of 1930, the party was renamed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, despite the fact that there were no Cambodians or Lao members of this party. So that the idea of there being a federation was consistent with Marxist-Leninist ideology, but in fact it was really a Vietnamese project which was dressed up to be something consistent with Marxism-Leninism.
Let me move away from the Marxist-Leninist view and go back to the Vietnamese imperial ambition, as you call it. On page 01001714, you say that the factor of Vietnamese imperial ambition is, quote, a deeply rooted element of Vietnamese elite political culture, end of quote. Can you explain to the Chamber what you mean with that, and how do you know?
Most Vietnamese whom I know do not have, well, sorry, let me rephrase that. Most educated Vietnamese whom I know have a condescending view of Cambodians. It's not a hatred, but it is a condescending view regarding the Cambodians as being somehow inferior culturally. And there is a history during the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia in the 19th century where humiliation of the Cambodians was an important part of political life. That wasn't so much true of the Thai military occupation of Cambodia in the 19th century. So I think that there is a sense that there are two completely different cultures, the Khmer and the Vietnamese, and that the Vietnamese regard themselves as superior, even if they don't express that always explicitly and publicly.
See if I understand it correctly. In your dissertation at English ERN 01335046, you're saying something similar, but I'm not quite sure if it is. Let me quote that to you. Thus, two factors encouraged Vietnamese communist ambition towards Cambodia: traditional Vietnamese nationalism, which was politically expansionist and culturally intolerant, and revolutionary Marxist-Leninist internationalist ideology, which favored political integration of disparate peoples in the service of a world revolution. Here you speak about traditional Vietnamese nationalism. Is that also what you mean when you speak about culture, or is that something different?
I think that is part of culture. The nationalism is part of the Vietnamese culture. And I think that, yes, I think that Vietnamese nationalism has been expansionist until recent times. I wouldn't say that that's true of the government of Vietnam today, that it is expansionist, but it has been true in past centuries, and I think it was true during the era of both Ho Chi Minh and Les Duan's domination of the Vietnamese Communist movement.
Let's move to various perspectives on this very same issue, the imperial ambitions of Vietnam and its wish to create an Indo-Chinese federation. There's various perspectives that we can use, of course. We can have the Vietnamese perspective and for instance, have a look at the Soviet archives. I will be doing that shortly. But let's first have the Cambodian perspective on Vietnamese ambitions or Vietnamese encroachments upon Cambodian territory and Indochina in general. You've mentioned him already before. Of course, he's an absolute key figure in Cambodian politics, and that is late King Father Sihanouk. Based on your interview, based on the things he has said and that you quoted in your books, could you explain to the Chamber what Prince Sihanouk's views were in the 60s, developing into the 70s and the 80s, on Vietnamese ambitions toward Cambodia?
I think that the King Father's views were that he would try as effectively as possible to preserve Cambodian independence, Cambodian national identity, and he was very pragmatic in the policies he pursued. In the beginning of the 1960s, he turned against the United States more strongly by the mid-60s. But then, as a result of domestic pressures, in part from the elite, he became more critical of the Vietnamese, or at least more distant from the Vietnamese communist ambition, and he tried to reconcile Cambodia with the United States. And I think that the King Father Sihanouk was somebody who acted very rationally and with very careful judgment about what was in the best interests of Cambodian independence.
Let me follow up and refer you to two citations from Prince Sihanouk, late King Father Sihanouk. You use both excerpts in your dissertation and in your book. Let me just refer to the citation in your dissertation, English ERN 01335073, and this is what you wrote. Sihanouk was fearful, as all Cambodians traditionally have been, of the ambitions of all Vietnamese. As he wrote in January 1963, quote, "Whether he is called Gia Long, Ho Chi Minh, or Ngo Dinh Diem, no Annamite, or Vietnamese, will sleep peacefully until he has succeeded in pushing Cambodia toward annihilation, having made its first go through the stages of slavery." And then you say he reiterated the same attitude nearly 20 years later. In his Souvenirs doux et amers, in his memoirs, you quote him as having written the following: The Khmer people have serious reasons not to like the Vietnamese. Our neighbors in the east have in effect, in the course of the centuries, swallowed territories which had always belonged to Cambodia and have colonized them, leaving to the local population only the choice between submission and flight. These two excerpts of speeches, I believe, or his memoirs from Sihanouk, is this something that you've also come across in your interview with him? Has this been his continuous position as to Vietnamese imperial ambitions?
To be honest, I don't actually recall if this came up in my interview with him, which was in 1985. But it is consistent with his view. But the late King Father made it very clear that Cambodia had to live with Vietnam, that it had to accept as reality the existence of Vietnam to the east and not try to pursue policies that might encourage a more aggressive Vietnamese policy. I think that's been his consistent position.
Do you remember, or have you used Sihanouk's speech before the Security Council of the United Nations in January 1979, when he was in very, very strong words condemning Vietnamese aggression and the Vietnamese invasion?
I have only a vague memory of that speech, to be honest.
Well, if that's the case, then I will not ask you questions about that. Maybe tomorrow, when we speak about the actual invasion. Do you know if there was any difference between Prince Sihanouk's perspective on Vietnam's imperial ambitions and the subsequent Lon Nol government? Did Lon Nol have any different views of Vietnamese ambitions or Vietnamese encroachments of territory?
I think that Lon Nol had a resentment of the Vietnamese, but a very unrealistic estimate of what Cambodia could do about it. Cambodia was not in a position to defeat the Vietnamese armies, especially of the north, during the war, during the Vietnam War, as we call it in the United States, or the American War, as the Vietnamese communists call it. I think Lon Nol was a not very rational man and was not a pragmatist like the late King Father. And he made a huge blunder in participating and leading the coup d'etat.
I understand you're talking about reactions, and earlier you were also talking about reactions, but for now I'm interested in their perception of Vietnamese ambitions. Were they the same?
Madon.
President, please hold on.
I'm not sufficiently expert on Lon Nol's thinking to be able to answer that correctly.
That's no problem. Now we have very briefly discussed the Cambodian perspective on Vietnamese ambitions toward Indochina. Now, of course, there are many other key players who had views as to what Vietnam's intentions were, are, and have been toward Indochina. Do you know what China's perspective was, very briefly already from the 50s and the 60s, toward Vietnam and its foreign policy? What did China believe Vietnam's ambitions to be?
China, I think, initially played a role as a kind of godfather for, as a patron of the Vietnamese in the early 1950s, and trained a lot of Vietnamese communists in the ideology and institutional life of Maoist China as it was then. I think that the Chinese always wanted to see the Vietnamese as pliable client of China, which the Vietnamese were not willing to be except when they had an ideological dispute with the Soviet Union under Khrushchev. I think that the Chinese developed a concern about Vietnamese ambitions after the outbreak of the Sino-Soviet dispute, when it was felt, especially in the 1970s, that Vietnam had become a client of the Soviet Union, and therefore that any aggressive acts or imperial type acts by Vietnam would be at least in the interests of, to the advantage of, and perhaps under the influence of, the Soviet Union. So it was really in the 1970s that China became very skeptical of Vietnam's intentions.
Well, let me follow up on this. We will be discussing how how China saw Vietnam's ambitions after 1975, and of course we will be discussing Deng Xiaoping's famous saying, calling the Vietnamese the hooligans of the East. But let me refer you to what a renowned French Vietnam scholar said to the French High Commissioner in 1965. This French scholar is called Paul Mus, M-U-S, and you're not referring to him, but Nayan Chanda is in his book E3/2376 on English ERN 00192311 and Khmer 001944 and 49, and French 0023713. Chanda says Paul Mu, a renowned Vietnam scholar and former advisor to the French High Commissioner, said in 1965 that China made concessions to the French in Geneva in order to deny the Vietnamese full mastery over Indochina. This view of Paul Mus, by the way, is confirmed by another French historian, François Joyot, mentioned on that same page. So it seems that China, at least according to the French, was already quite worried about Vietnam's intentions of full mastery of Indochina. Would you agree?
I think that could be one interpretation from Chinese behavior at Geneva. But I think that certainly the Chinese would have been aware of Vietnamese role in Cambodia during the 1950s, the Vietnamese communist role in Cambodia during the 1950s, and would have probably regarded the Vietnamese as having an ambition to control Cambodia and Laos through the parties that the Vietnamese themselves had set up in 1951. In 1951, the Vietnamese created proto-communist parties in both Cambodia and Laos, which had few Cambodians or Laos in them, and were dominated by people of mixed ethnic background, including people of mixed, of partial part Vietnamese heritage. And that has been a long-standing method during the period of Les Duan, during the period from the 1930s through the 1970s. It was the ambition of the Vietnamese to use people whom they regarded as being loyal to them to create communist parties in other countries.
As I said, I will come back to China, and especially to what Deng Xiaoping and Deng Biao have said about Vietnamese actions between 75 and 79. Of course, very important players in the region geopolitically are or still are the Americans and countries neighboring Indochina, for instance the Indonesians. Are you aware of conversations that Ford and Kissinger had in, I believe, November 1975 with General Suharto on what they thought Vietnam's ambitions would be in relation to Indochina?
No, I'm not familiar with those conversations. I don't recall them.
Then I will move on. I'm not at liberty to, unfortunately, to quote for them from these documents. But would it surprise you that Suharto was afraid of Vietnamese ambitions toward Indochina?
No, it wouldn't surprise me.
Let me move on to, of course, maybe the most important perspective or sources, and that is how the Vietnamese themselves saw Indochina and Cambodia, and that is, I think, partially something which we can find back in the conversations that various Soviet ambassadors had with leading Vietnamese Communist Party members in 71 and 73. I'm referring to, let me start by referring to a conversation that Ambassador Cherbakov had with high-ranking Vietnamese officials. It is mentioned in your book on English ERN 0100 178. I'd be happy to quote from it first, but maybe I should ask an open question. What is it that you found was told to Soviet ambassadors in the early 70s as to Vietnamese ambitions and Vietnamese wishes to establish a federation of Indochina?
Well, there is one reference in my book to conversations, or at least with regard to the concept of the Indochina Federation. But later there's also a conversation between Les Xuan and a Soviet official about, at the time of the heightened conflict between the Vietnamese communists and the Democratic Kampuchean communists. And at that point he said, eventually everything, he says something to the effect, eventually everything will be in order in Cambodia. They have no other way. So I think that there was a suggestion there that the Vietnamese had the upper hand over what happened in Cambodia.
Let me see if I can assist your memory a bit and refer you to English ERN 0100 1733, and let me read it to you. In February 1973, the Soviet ambassador to North Vietnam spelled out what he believed to be Hanoi's goals. Quote, "The program of the Vietnamese Comrades for Indochina is to replace the reactionary regime in Saigon, Vientiane and Phnom Penh with progressive ones, and later, when all Vietnam and also Laos and Cambodia start on the road to socialism, to move toward the establishment of a federation of the Indochinese countries. The course of the Vietnamese Workers' Party flows from the program of the former Communist Party of Indochina." And the same was said 2 years earlier, and then that particular ambassador was cautioning the Vietnamese to be very careful with this subject because, as he said, it was a delicate matter. Does this jog your memory?
Yes, it does.
Since we only have your quotes in your book, do you remember more specifics about these conversations? For instance, do you have reason to believe that the Soviet ambassadors who were present, or the people who formulated what was said during these conversations, were accurate in their description? How was this conversation read down in Russian? Do you have a recollection of what you saw in the Soviet archives?
On this particular quotation, no, I do not have a recollection of what I saw in the archives. Yeah, I can't add anything to it. But just let me say that I was reading from either reports of Soviet intelligence services on conversations that took place, or reports of the Soviet ambassador of conversations that had taken place. So I have no reason to doubt the veracity of what was said it was a function of Soviet diplomats to give the best possible information to Moscow in order to formulate policy.
You interviewed a Vietnamese high-ranking South Vietnamese high-ranking, communist. I think I might refer to him as that. Trong Nhu Tang. In his interview, did you discuss these Indochina Federation ambitions with him, or is it something that you don't recall?
It's not something that I recall discussing with him, and it's probably unlikely because at the time in which Mr. Trong Nhu Tang made his appearances in the West, he was more concerned with the situation of human rights in Vietnam. That was one of the main, and the deceptive role that the Vietnamese communists had played in attracting people to their side during the war. And I think that that was the thrust of what he'd like to talk about, because he felt he had been used by the Communist Party leadership in order to give a much broader sense of popular support for the communists than existed. So I don't recall discussing with him, and I doubt that we did discuss it.
Are you aware of testimony that he gave in 1981 before the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the House of Representatives, U.S. Congress, on the matter of Vietnamese ambitions?
I don't recall it, I'm sorry.
Mr. President, I'll be referring to this document, which is now admitted into evidence. I'm not sure what the E3 number is.
We have sent an email with
yeah,
that.
yes, I heard, but I don't have it here right now. On English ERN 10041745, he refers to the Indo-Chinese Federation, and he says, I understand that Hanoi has also supported the project of an Indo-Chinese Federation, as was the wish of Ho Chi Minh. Is that something that you have found as well, that it was apparently a long-standing wish of Ho Chi Minh to create this Indo-Chinese Federation?
Yes, I think it was. I should add, though, that Ho Chi Minh ceased to be a dominant figure in the policy making of the Vietnamese communists from the 1960s when he became ill. As you know, he died in 1969. But that ambition was carried forth by two of the principal figures in the Communist Party, Le Duan and Le Duc Tho. And in fact, during the French colonial era, Le Duc Tho had the, quote, the Cambodia portfolio for the Vietnamese Communist Party and for the Indo-Chinese communists in general. So I think that, yes, that was an ambition he had, because Ho Chi Minh was formed by the Communist International in his political education from 1923 until at least 1938, if not longer.
Now, as you rightfully said, he was not, Trong Nhu Tang was not a inner circle member of the Vietnamese Workers' Party. I mean, he wasn't in the standing committee or in the central committee. But one person who, of course, is someone I think who is extremely relevant as to understand Le Duan or Le Duan and Le Duc d'O's ambitions. And that is someone, I think you used his book in your book, Hong Van Hon, one of the founders of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, Politburo member, foreign policy expert of Vietnam. Can you briefly explain first to the Chamber who he was and what he said about Vietnam's ambitions once he had defected in '79 to China?
Hoang Van Hoan was a senior member of the Vietnamese Communist Party who had a pro-Chinese orientation. And I believe that during the time of the Vietnamese tilt and shift towards the Soviet bloc, he became disillusioned and eventually defected to China. I don't recall I may actually have a quote from him in my book, but I don't recall it, to be quite honest.
In your secondary sources there is a reference to his book, A Drop in the Ocean, which he wrote in the early 80s while he was in China. That book has just been, an excerpt from that book has just been admitted into evidence. He speaks about Le Duan or Le Duan, and he refers to him as the hegemonic overlord of Indochina, and combining it with that same ambitions. Is that something that you recall, that was his position?
I'm sure that was his position. Since he had defected to China, that would have been the Chinese position at the time. These quotes, I wrote a book of several hundred pages, which has a lot of quotes in it, and to be honest, I don't recall every one of them. Some 17 years later.
I have a full understanding of that. But what I do like to know, and I will be revisiting him some more, but he was a Politburo member of the Vietnamese Workers' Party and the Communist Party all the way up until the moment he was kicked out or he had to resign, end of 1976. That being the situation, would you agree with me that he had unparalleled insight into the inner workings and ambitions of the Vietnamese Communist Party?
I would agree with that.
Let me finish, Mr. President, I have 5 more minutes, with the views of an American scholar we discussed before the break, Douglas Pike. As you agreed, very insightful as to Vietnamese foreign policy. He also reported to U.S. Congress in October 1978. Mr. President, that is document E3/2370. Let me move to his final, to his conclusions. It's called Some Conclusions About the Border War. It is English ERN 00187396. and French translation only 003-44747 until 48. This is what he says, and my question will be whether you would agree with him, yes or no. The Cambodian-Vietnamese heritage of mutual ill will and distrust is as deep and abiding as exists anywhere, comparable to the Greek-Turkish, Arab-Jew, Muslim-Hindu, and Tibetanese. Cambodia's historic experience is that foreign relations devices which work well elsewhere, such as balance of power politics and military alliances, do not work for Cambodia. And then the most important one, Vietnamese communists long have regarded a federation of Indochina as the proper, ultimate political configuration for the peninsula. Of necessity, this would require Cambodian and Laotian acquiescence, or at least find rulers in the two countries who are amenable to the idea. In creating a federation of Indochina, the Vietnamese are in no hurry. End of quote. Would you agree with his analysis, especially that point where he speaks of the Federation of Indochina as the proper ultimate political configuration?
Yes, the Vietnamese communists at the time would have thought like that. I would agree.
Mr. President, this might be a good moment to take the break.
President, thank you, Mr. Expert. It is now convenient time for the adjournment. The Chamber will resume its hearing tomorrow, Wednesday, 19 October 2016 from 9 o'clock. And the hearing tomorrow, the Chamber continue to hear the testimony of expert Stephen Morris. Thank you, Mr. Expert Stephen Morris. The hearing of your testimony as an expert has not yet concluded. You are therefore invited to come back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Court officer, in collaboration with VISU, please make necessary transport arrangement to send the expert to where he is staying and invite him back to the courtroom tomorrow at 9. Security personnel are instructed to bring Khieu Sampon and Nuon Chea back to the detention facility and have them returned to the courtroom tomorrow morning before 9 a.m. The court is now adjourned.